the Lord. Amen. Well, this morning we're finishing up with Solomon. And our topic this morning is to look at Solomon's writings. And so Solomon, we know, had a mixed journey with the Lord blessing him, making many promises for him, which the Lord kept. Unfortunately, Solomon didn't keep his end of the bargain, and we see that as we will be going through what we're sharing and what Solomon has shared this morning. We're going to be looking at Proverbs. All of the Proverbs, the book of Proverbs was written by Solomon. It's a collection of wisdom and teachings. Then we're going to take a look at Ecclesiastes, also written by Solomon. And then, if we have time, we'll look at the Song of Solomon, obviously also written by Solomon. So Solomon, who had this gift of wisdom, thankfully, the Lord laid it upon his heart to share his thoughts with us. I was thinking how we can have things that God has given to us, and it's wonderful for ourselves, but it's very important that we share that with others. And so Solomon does that, and through his writings, we're going to see sort of the progression and a realization at the end, in particular in Ecclesiastes, as Solomon sort of sums up his life's journey, which if you read Ecclesiastes doesn't sound really great, but we'll get to that in a moment. So let's start in Proverbs. Proverbs is an interesting section of the Bible to read. It's not like the others. As I said, it's a collection, right? It's not particularly an account of anything. It doesn't go from one event to the other. It's a series of small sections. And so that's often how we use and how we read Proverbs. You read a few verses and they're sort of connected together. But overall, the general theme of Proverbs is the idea of wisdom. And so Solomon, who was given that wisdom by the Lord, takes the knowledge that he has accumulated and he applies it, which of course is what wisdom is all about. And, as long as he was applying what the Lord gave him according to God's instruction, then everything was going okay. But there are times, as we've seen in the past couple of weeks, where that was not the case. And things slipped, other things got in which shouldn't have, and so Solomon ended up in trouble. But as he writes here, we're starting in chapter 1 of Proverbs, we see at the beginning here, he tells us what the purpose is of his sharing and why he writes these things down. So it starts in verse 1, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. And then he gives us purpose. To know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, and judgment, and equity, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. So he's writing the Proverbs for that reason there. Basically, in my own words, he wants to share what God has given to him. He specifies a little bit there in verse 4 when he talks about the young man getting knowledge and discretion. I'm sure we would all agree, youth is relative. And so, depending on where you are on the age scale, and you look backwards a little bit, anybody who is half your age is young. And then they would say to you, well, we're not that young, because they look at backwards and they look at somebody who's half their age again. And so you could ask somebody who's 6 years old if they're young, and they'll say no, because there's somebody here who's 3 or 2. So when Solomon writes here to those that are young, that doesn't mean that we should exclude ourselves from that. It could be young in knowledge or young in wisdom, as chronological age does not necessarily and often doesn't correlate to wisdom or knowledge. And so we can have a lot of people that are elderly in years, naturally, but don't necessarily have knowledge or wisdom. And so Solomon is here sharing, and as he says, in verse 2, interestingly enough, he talks about to know, and then he says to perceive, and then in verse 3, he says to receive, and then in verse 4, it's to give. All right? So there's a bit of a progression there, and again, ultimately at the end, his goal is to give. And I think as God's people, that should be an ultimate goal for all of us as well. Right? We come, and as you've gathered here this morning, I trust it so that you would know perhaps a little bit more, or be reminded of something you already know and understand. But ultimately, we want to take what God has given us and share it with others. So Solomon says that. Okay? And then he says, with his first sort of point of wisdom, he says, a wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsel. To understand a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. Okay. So, Solomon is telling us, if we jump to verse 6, there is something that we need in order to understand a proverb and the interpretation of that proverb. We need something, okay? And we need something to understand the words of the wise and their dark sayings. Now, when he talks about dark sayings, he's not talking about evil or anything of that nature. He's talking just about things that we don't necessarily, they're not immediately obvious to us, okay? Something that you hear, and yet you don't understand. So he's talking about things that are hard to understand there. And he gives us the answer to, or what we need in order to understand Proverbs. He tells us in verse 5, right? A wise man will hear and will increase learning. A man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsel. So basically what he's talking about there is that those that wish to understand Proverbs will go to a source that will help us with that understanding. Okay? And what he's speaking about there is the Lord. Okay? So he's talking about the fact that when we look at things in the Scripture, be it a proverb or another section of Scripture, that what we really want to do first is go to the Lord and ask Him to prepare us for that teaching, to prepare us for that information, really that knowledge and that sharing of wisdom that He is going to give to us. So on our own, and we've sort of touched on that a little bit lately, our own knowledge isn't going to help us with what we see in the Scripture. Right? It's spiritual understanding and knowledge that we require. And that comes from the Lord. And so, in gaining wisdom, we become wise. And as we gain in our wisdom and we get wiser, we should learn more and more how much we need the Lord. Okay? Because it is really wisdom that helps us to see that we require God for more wisdom. It's a bit of a circular kind of a thing, right? It's sort of like the gift of salvation, right? We can't attain it on our own. The Lord gives us that gift, and once we have it, we really begin to understand more and more how much we need it and how much we should be thankful for God to give it to us. So the deeper we get with the Lord, in a sense, the more we recognize how small we are and how much we need God's help. So somebody who doesn't know the Lord at all thinks they know everything, thinks they don't need anybody's help. Okay? But when we give ourselves over to God, we actually then suddenly recognize how small we really are and how much we really need the Lord. And I believe the more we walk with Him, the more we understand how much we need Him. Okay? And so for wisdom, we have to go to the source of that wisdom, and that is the Lord. He is our wise counsel, all right? And he will help us to increase in our learning. So the book of Proverbs is, sometimes we tend to pull verses out of them very quickly, but they do require us to meditate on those verses, just like all of the scripture, right? You hear people sort of flippantly quote verses, but perhaps not understand totally what the full meaning of those verses is. And that requires God's presence inside all of us. So Solomon begins the Proverbs by stating that, okay? And then in verse 7, he sort of leads us to this point where he says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Okay? You know my definition of wisdom, right? It's very simple, the application of knowledge. Okay? If wisdom is the application of knowledge, and then when I say that, I really need to also qualify the godly application of knowledge, the appropriate application of knowledge as led by the Lord. Okay? If wisdom is the application of knowledge, it can't have wisdom without any knowledge. Make sense? Okay. If wisdom is the application of knowledge, the proper use of knowledge, then you need knowledge in order to have some wisdom. Okay. And so when Solomon says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, he's also letting us know that respect for God, that recognition that God understands everything, controls everything, that he's the one that we should be going to. As we go to him, he imparts also the knowledge to us. Okay? And so we take that knowledge that God gives, and then we put that together, and as we apply it properly, we gain wisdom. And so that's really what he's saying there. But fools despise wisdom and instruction, because we need knowledge and wisdom together. Okay? And only the Lord can give us that. And as we've said many times, lots of people you might know that have a lot of knowledge, but they really have no wisdom, because it's just not properly applied. Okay? So we take that section, and then we jump a little bit here. We're just going to go over to Proverbs chapter 3. So really this morning's lesson is, I said to Stephanie, I don't like, these are for me some of the most difficult lessons, because there's not particularly a story or a theme or an event that's taking place, right? We're just pulling from sections, right? So I guess the first thing I want to make sure that you understand when you leave this morning Sunday school is that the Proverbs were written by Solomon, okay? And they are a collection of teachings and wise sayings, okay? And so when you go to Proverbs now, from here on in, remember this is Solomon, God's Spirit working through Solomon, sharing what the Lord has given to him, all right? So when we jump now to chapter 3, and we're just going to pull a section from chapter 3. And before I start reading, let me also say this. Solomon shares with us a lot of knowledge, and he shares with us statements of wisdom. But he himself, certainly later in his life's journey, seems to fail to apply the wisdom that God has given him. So I guess I'm adding another layer here now, right? You can have knowledge, you can be wise, because you know how to apply that knowledge and use that knowledge, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you actually use it. Okay? And the reason I say that is because if you go to chapter 3 and you start reading at verse 13, happy is the man that findeth wisdom and the man that getteth understanding. Okay? Now that statement in itself, interestingly enough, again, if you know about Solomon's life, and when we read in a moment in Ecclesiastes, he was far from happy. And he says so in Ecclesiastes. Solomon was not a happy person. He might have in the outward sort of looked happy, and people probably looked at him and thought, how could he be anything but happy? He has everything that he might want, and he says that. And he has knowledge and he has wisdom, but what Solomon failed to do was apply it properly. Okay? So here he makes a statement about how to be happy in a sense, and yet Solomon failed to learn from his own knowledge and his own wisdom that God gave him. It's an interesting thing, something for you to ponder, I suppose. All right? It's another one of these sort of thoughts where we know what we should do, that's the knowledge. We know how to apply it properly, that's the wisdom piece. And yet sometimes we just don't do it. Okay? There's a break there and a failure there. And Solomon, I think, is unfortunately an example of that. So here he says, happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding. For the merchandise of it, now he's talking about the value of wisdom. Okay, the merchandise of it is better than the merchandise of silver, and the gain thereof than fine gold. She, referring to wisdom, is more precious than rubies, and all the things thou canst desire are not to be compared unto her. Length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to them that lay hold upon her, and happy is everyone that retaineth her. Okay? Now when you read this, Solomon is obviously sharing that wisdom, there's nothing more valuable, it would appear, as he looks at this, right? He talks about how it's more precious than rubies. You can't, the things thou canst desire are not to be compared unto her. So anything you can imagine, anything you could want, nothing has more value than wisdom. These writings in Proverbs, we believe, are early on in Solomon's life. And here he has a grasp, he has an understanding, really, we would say today, and I would say, that material things, rubies, right, all this other things that he talks about, the gold, money, you can have millions in your bank account, billions in your bank account. You can have investments everywhere. You can have the biggest yachts. You can have, a mansion on every continent or whatever country or any of these things. You can have all of these things, and Solomon understands at this point, Solomon understands that those things are not as important, don't have the same value as wisdom does. And really, I suppose we could then say he's really talking about the gifts that God can give us are far more valuable than any of these other things. Now, as we think about that, and we recognize that, here is somebody who had untold wealth, right? I mean, Solomon, not only did he have the wisdom that God gave him, but he starts to accumulate things. And so we saw, right? He trades with the Egyptian government and with the powers in Egypt. He gets one of his first wives from there as part of that sort of bonding between those nations, and he builds an army. Great army from there. And he starts to accumulate things. Here's somebody who basically has more money than he knows what to do with. He has more power than anybody else on the planet. Okay? And he gains things, and he gains things, and he gains things. All right. Turn with me now just a little bit further to Ecclesiastes. The end of Proverbs, you will find Ecclesiastes. And as it says in my Bible, or the preacher. And Solomon here is referring to himself. Okay? Solomon is the preacher that is being spoken of here. And how can I say that? Well, in chapter 1 it says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And that was Solomon. Okay? So in this particular book, he refers to himself that particular way. Ecclesiastes, we believe, was written much later in his life. Okay? This is coming towards the end of his life. And in a way, it's sort of like his memoirs. Okay? He's writing, he's reflecting, he's looking back on his life, and he's sharing his conclusions about his life. Well, what does he say? We're still in that first chapter. He says, vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Well, what a statement that is. Okay? Right? Pointless. That's the word that I put in there. Right? Pointlessness, saith the preacher, all is pointless. Nothing has any point. Why are we doing this? And then he continues. What profit hath a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. What you're going to see now, if I give you a little hint as to what we're going to read, Solomon reflects on the ever sort of cyclical nature of life. Okay? A generation comes, a generation goes. A generation comes, a generation goes. He's going to talk about the flow of nature. All of these things. And basically, he comes to this conclusion that as an individual, right, who is this great man, he's coming and then he's gone. He will be finished. This is his sort of way of looking at things at this point. And yet the earth will continue. Okay? So it's in a sense, he's looking at his life, and sometimes you'll hear people say, well, what's the meaning of life? Why am I here? What's my purpose? Or some people will say, or they'll sort of reflect, will I be remembered? Right? Here I am, and one day I'll pass away, and then maybe they'll put a grave marker of some sort for me someplace, and over time the engraving on the granite will start to fade away, and the next generation will come, and the next generation will go, and on and on and on, and nobody's going to remember me. How far back can you remember? How many generations can you go back and talk about? Right? I can remember, obviously, my father, and then my grandfather, and then even my grandfather. I know things about his life, but maybe there are details there, probably many things, that I'm not fully aware of. What about his father? I don't have a clue. And his? And I've only gone back, 4 generations? Maybe 5? So Solomon is reflecting on his greatness and how it's basically going to evaporate. And he's wondering if anybody is going to remember him. What was the point, I guess, is what he's saying. What's the point that I've collected all these things, that I've done all of these things? Let's go on, verse 5. The sun also ariseth, and the sun goeth down, and hasteneth to his place where he arose. The wind goeth towards the south, and turneth about unto the north. It whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to its circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, if the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. All things are full of labor. Man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be. And that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before us. See, Solomon is kind of reflecting, in a sense, sometimes, well, let's look at it ourselves. Sometimes we think we've done something so amazing, right? And in fact, is it really that amazing? Chances are somebody's already done it. Okay. And Solomon sort of looks at, again, he's looking at his life, and I wrote in my Bible, a sad reflection. He's not satisfied. Okay, as we go on, we're going to see there is no satisfaction, all right? Verse 11, there is no remembrance of former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of things that are to come with those that shall come after. Okay? So things they just fade away, they're forgotten, and he's thinking about himself there. I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. And I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. This sore travail hath God given to the sons of men to be exercised wherewith. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. In a sense, when we look at verse 13, he's almost cursing God for his wisdom that he was given. Okay? Because you look at it and he says he was given by wisdom. He's searching out all things that are done under heaven, and he said, this sore travail hath God given to the sons of man. Okay? He's not talking about it as a positive gift here. He's talking about it as a negative. And this is very sad. Right? And this is something that we have to make sure we don't fall into the same kind of a trap. Right? Because sometimes we can, if we're not careful, we can feel very sorry for ourselves. I did all of this thing, and what was the point? What was the purpose? What good is it? Right? So you build a beautiful home, right? And when you're gone, somebody's going to come along, and who knows what's going to happen to it. They're going to move in, they're going to gut the whole place. You've collected all of these amazing things, and they're sitting on a shelf, and you care for them, and you watch over them, and somebody's going to come, and they're going to throw them in the trash because they have no idea what their value is. I can think, we can all do this, right? Personally. I labored for an entire summer and dug a pond by hand. Wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow. And someday somebody's going to come along and fill the whole thing in. Because somebody's going to move over there at some point, and they're not going to want a pond. And so we can do all kinds of things, right? And what we have to accept and thank God for is the pleasure, the joy that is able to be attained through these things today, right? That God has given us. And so we thank the Lord for today. We should all do that. Not only because we don't know about tomorrow, right? But because this is a gift that God has given. So Solomon, he's failing to do that. He's looking at, he's sort of like, he's saying, I've been a lifelong student. I'm gaining wisdom, gaining wisdom, gaining wisdom, gaining wisdom. I'm going to die, and what happens to it all? Does anybody benefit from it? He's sort of asking that question, right? You know, so when he says there in verse 13, I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. And when he comes to a conclusion, he's not that happy with his conclusion. Because remember what he's just finished writing. All things that are done under heaven, nothing is new. It just keeps repeating itself over and over and over and over again. Right? So he's lost the joy of the Lord. He's lost, the awe over what the Lord gives us. And again, I look at that and I think, yeah, I have to make sure that I haven't lost that. Right? We get used to the flowers blooming. We get used to the sunset. If you live at Niagara Falls, how many times have you been to Niagara Falls? You walk past it, oh yeah, the water's still going down. You get used to it, right? We start to forget the awe and the beauty of what is there as the sun comes up and the birds are singing and any of those kind of things, right? We lose those things if we're not careful, right? And so Solomon seems to have lost all of that, right? Verse 14, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. That which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered. There's more problems than I can count. So he's sort of fixated on a lot of negative things here. I communed with mine own heart, saying, Lo, I am come to great estate, and have gotten more wisdom than all they that have been before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge, and I gave my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is vexation of spirit. Verse 18, for in such wisdom is much grief. For in much wisdom is much grief. And in that increaseth, and he that increaseth knowledge increases sorrow. What a statement. Everything that God has given him, in a sense, he's lost. He's no longer able to see the benefit of the wisdom that God gave him. And in a sense, I think, he's kind of like a person that elevates himself to this high position only to suddenly recognize that he's going into the ground like everybody else. And so everything that he has done, he's saying, what was the point? Right? What was the point? And I wrote in my Bible here, right, for verse 18, that his statement there, I believe, is very true if you don't have the Lord. Right? So I wrote, true without God. See, without the Lord, much wisdom is much grief. And without the Lord, he that increaseth knowledge increases sorrow. But when we have the Lord, then I believe, I know, we see everything in a different light. Okay? It's not like, beginning and end when we have God. We recognize there is a perpetual eternity waiting for us, right? And what we do here, certainly in the natural, many of those things, to be blunt, are pointless. But what is done spiritually always has purpose. That's what's going to last. That's what the Bible tells us, right? So Solomon has all of this wealth and his treasures, right? If I were to steal a little bit from now, other verses, right? His treasures are all the natural things that rust is going to corrupt and the moths are going to eat, right? And it's all going to fade away. And so he's looking at this and he's just feeling empty. Complete emptiness. Because by the time he's writing these things, right, he has really strayed. And I would say he's backslidden. Or he's certainly well on the way, if there is such a thing, right? So he's looking for happiness. Don't we know people like that? Right? They never seem to be satisfied. Solomon was like that. Let's keep reading. Chapter 2. I said in mine heart, go to now, I will prove thee with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure, and behold, this also is vanity. So, after Solomon has all of these things, now what's he going to do? Well, the things aren't making me happy anymore. The things aren't satisfying anymore. Now I'm going to have to start with behaviors. So basically, he becomes a party person, right? He says, okay, I'm going to fulfill my life here with things of pleasure. And one of Solomon's greatest downfalls, as he's searching for that pleasure, all right, and well, I'll let him say it, okay? Verse 2. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth it? I sought in mine heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainting my heart with wisdom, and to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was that good of the sons of men, which they should do under the heaven all the days of their life. I made me great works. I builded me houses. I planted me vineyards. I made me gardens and orchards, and I planted trees in them of all kinds of fruit. I made me pools of water to water therewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. I got me servants and maidens, and had servants born in my house. Also I had great possessions of great and small cattle, above all that were in Jerusalem before me. I gathered me also silver and gold, and the peculiar treasures of kings and of the provinces. I gat me men singers and women singers, and the delights of the sons of men as musical instruments, and that of all sorts. So I was great, and increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. And whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion of all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do. And behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. So he looked for happiness, to sort of coin a phrase, in all the wrong places. Right? He makes an interesting statement that he says he still had the wisdom. But like I said before, it seems to me he wasn't applying it. And instead, he went after everything that he could imagine. Right? And we know, because we know historically, right, that even into sexual sin, right? I mean, it wasn't enough that he had one wife. He had to have two, then he had to have 3 and 4, and then he had to have hundreds, plus concubines. One can only imagine the sinful behavior that Solomon was a part of. As the world crept, well, not so much crept, but came in like a flood into his lifestyle. Because nothing was fulfilling. Nothing that he could get his hands on. And he says anything he wanted, he could have. Okay? But the hole was still there. The hole was still there. Now Solomon, to his credit, shares that with us. He tells us, right, that nothing filled the spot in his soul, in his spirit. There are a lot of people today that are living the same sort of lifestyle that Solomon lived. They might not have hundreds of wives or hundreds of cars or whatever, but you understand what I'm saying. They're going after anything they think that will make them happy, and when those things start to fail, then they give themselves over to wine, they give themselves over to drugs, partying, all hour, all kind of behavior, always more, always more, always more, and yet never enough. Okay? And then they wake up in the morning, sort of like verse 11 there, what Solomon says, and I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. It's a very, very sad statement, really. But, like I said, he admits it. And I think because he admits it, as you read through Ecclesiastes, you start to see some realizations coming to the fore. And so when we jump that, to Ecclesiastes 12th chapter, the final chapter in Ecclesiastes, and we go towards the end of that particular chapter, we finally sort of scrape away. Solomon, in a sense, has finally scraped everything away in his soul. Okay? He's finally digging through everything. You know, what was I doing? You know, all of these things. And if we start to pick this up at verse 9, so we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 9. And he says, and moreover, because the preacher was wise, so he's speaking of himself, he still taught the people knowledge, yea, he gave good heed and sought out and set in order many proverbs. So he acknowledges that there were still some good things he was doing, but he's starting to see here, I think, that those were the things of value. Okay, that's the point. All right? And he says, the preacher sought to find out acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even words of truth. So speaking of his writings now. The words of the wise are as goads, and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. And further by these, my son, be admonished. Of making many books there is no end. And much study is a weariness of the flesh. So you can go round and round and round and never gain from any of those things. But then, of course, verse 13, which is rather famous. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. Verse 13, right? I have it circled, I have an exclamation mark beside it. Right? Is a tremendous recognition that Solomon finally comes to this place. Right? And it's important for me, and I would encourage you to also just keep that verse in mind. Right? What is the duty, the whole duty of man? Right? Why are we here? What is my purpose? What am I supposed to be doing here? This is a question. These are questions. I had them, certainly as a young person. Right? What am I going to do with my life? There are many different ways that that question can be worded. But Solomon, and remember, the wisest man, God's wisdom given to him, finally reaches this conclusion that all of this time and energy and wealth that he spent collecting all of these things and building all of these amazing things for himself, all of that means nothing, because the whole duty of man is to fear God and keep his commandments. looks kind of small in a sense, right? Like, I mean, there aren't many words there. And it's pretty short. Right? You would almost hope somebody would say, well, what's your purpose? And then they'll produce a book, 5,000 pages, 20,000 pages, volumes of the purpose of a person. No, it's not that complicated. All right? I mean, it takes a lot to do what Solomon has written here, all right? To fear God and to keep his commandments. That involves a lot. But ultimately, Solomon, in the end, comes to this amazing truth, this conclusion. God really shows grace, I think, and pours out mercy upon him because he finally removes the veil, helps Solomon to dig through all of this stuff to come to this point, right, where he recognizes his life for the Lord is the most important thing of all. Did I serve him? And it really, all of us will at some point in time be at a stage in our lives, and I'm talking about the end of this natural life, right? And they talk about your life flashing before your eyes. No idea if that happens or not. Right? But the point is, as I'm lying on my deathbed, so to speak, and I'm taking my final breath, what a feeling of peace